every weekend on C-SPAN 2. Washington Journal continues.
Megan Hansen joins us from Salt Lake City. She's the research director for the Center for Growth and Opportunity, here to talk about the management of public lands. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
First, a little bit about your organization. How does it involve itself directly with this topic?
The Center for Growth and Opportunity is a university-based research center. We're located on campus at Utah State, which is in northern Utah. I'm lucky enough to live in one of the most beautiful places in the country, in my opinion, and we're surrounded by federal lands. Federal lands are a huge topic in Utah and across the West, and they're one among many of the issues that we study at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. We're interested in doing policy-relevant research that can help inform better public policy and hopefully improve people's lives.
So when it comes to management of those lands generally, what's the approach of the federal government, particularly the White House?
So most of my research has focused on a law called the Antiquities Act. And the Antiquities Act is a law that's over 100 years old. It was passed to allow the president in particular to set aside areas of federal land for permanent protection. And these areas are set aside to protect their scenic and historic importance. A lot of the most iconic, most beautiful places in America, like Arches National Park and Zion, were originally protected through the Antiquities Act. And I wanted to understand through my research, why does a law that has allowed for the protection of these beautiful areas that we all love so much, why has it also created so much controversy and conflict?
And then how would you answer that question?
What we found through our research was that the root cause of this controversy and conflict is the fact that the Antiquities Act provides no clear limits on the president's decision-making power. That means that the president can designate any areas he sees fit as a national monument. We've seen recently in the controversy over Bears Ears National Monument in my home state of Utah, we've seen this firsthand. So in 2016, President Obama designated Bears Ears, which is named for a pair of twin buttes in southern Utah's Red Rock country. And a lot of local people were upset. They felt that they hadn't been adequately consulted, that they had a lot of uncertainty about how they would be able to use these lands the way they had before for things like hunting and grazing and even recreation. Then a year later, in 2017, President Trump decided to reduce the size of Bears Ears from its original 1.3 million acres to just over 200,000 acres, so a significant reduction. And when that reduction happened, once again, there was a lot of controversy, a lot of local people saying, wait a second, I thought this area would be protected. And once again, we saw that unilateral power, that ability to establish monuments and to change them with the stroke of a pen, created a lot of controversy.
Megan Hansen, what's the typical justification of a president to either expand the amount that's protected or to decrease it?
You know, it depends on the president. Presidents throughout history have used the Antiquities Act to establish monuments or to increase their size or even to decrease them. And the justification is usually that these areas maybe need to be expanded to adequately protect the objects of significance that are on those lands, or perhaps they should be reduced because that area is too large. The Antiquities Act does say that the smallest area compatible with protection of these objects is what should be designated, but it doesn't provide any real guidance on what that means. And so there's been a lot of discretion, a lot of ability for presidents to determine for themselves what they think that means.
And so as a president decides to make these steps, is he required to consult with members of his administration, or required to consult with Congress or the state that's involved itself in making these type of decisions?
So that's one of the key problems with the Antiquities Act, is there is no requirement of consultation with Congress or with local stakeholders. And that's one of the recommendations that we make, is that some kind of requirement for consultation, either with Congress or with local stakeholders, would help achieve more cooperative management and reduce controversy and conflict.
Our guest with us, and if you want to ask her questions about federal land management and the approach that the president takes and what should be done about that, you can call us. For those of you, again, in the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-748-8000. And for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones, 202-748-8001. In one of those efforts in reforming the Antiquities Act, you say more consultation is needed and that should be written into law. Can you expand on those?
Of course. One option would be to require consultation with local leaders, such as the state governor in the relevant state where a monument is being considered. Another option would be to require a notice and comment period. we already require for federal regulations, we require a notice and comment period where the public can go on and comment and provide their input about the local area and the likely impacts of a monument designation. It would also give experts who might have really good knowledge and the ability to help us better manage these areas. It would give us the opportunity to learn from those experts before we decide how we're going to manage these areas.
I suppose if I'm a state, though, and I want access to the land for mining rights or natural things, these kind of decisions by the president either help or hinder those causes. But as a state, how much access would they get if the president decides to expand it? Does that mean it automatically closes them to mining and other efforts?
Not necessarily. And when we talk about national monuments, it's important to remember that we're not talking about taking federal lands and turning them into state lands or private lands. We're talking about taking lands that are already federal and changing the way that they're managed, but they remain federal lands both before and after a monument designation. Now, a monument management plan can change the way that area is managed, and it can restrict things like mineral development. Even recreation can be restricted as well. It just depends on the management plan that's put into place for that area.
The Antiquities Act was signed into law in 1906, I believe. Why hasn't some consensus been able to be found on these efforts?
That's a great question. It's an old law. It's over 100 years old, and it's still having huge impacts, creating a lot of controversy today. There have been discussions about reforming the Antiquities Act, but there haven't been any major reforms. There have been some reforms that are state-specific. So both Wyoming and Alaska are basically exempt from the Antiquities Act, meaning congressional approval would be required to establish a monument in those states. But aside from those changes, we haven't seen a lot of consensus on how to reform the law. And I think a big reason for that is that the law's terms are very vague. I mentioned the law says that the smallest area compatible with management of these lands should be designated, but there's a lot of disagreement about what that term means, and it's really up for interpretation. There's also been a lot of lawsuits, there's been a lot of litigation that has resulted from this controversy. But courts have generally deferred to Congress and said, look, and deferred to the president in particular and said, we're going to allow the president to decide what these terms mean, and we're not going to overturn his decision.
When it comes then to the act of preserving these lands, is there a standard then to help meet, here's something of historical different or importance, here's something of scientific importance? Are there standards to help define those?
You know, there's really not. And that's another big part of the problem, is that what is an object of historic or scenic significance? Again, that's very much up to the interpretation of the president and what he determines is worthy of protection.
There's a viewer off of Twitter who says this: get the federal government out of the real estate business, just return the power and land to the states. Is there good and bad to that argument?
That's a great question and a great point. A lot of debate goes on about whether these lands should remain federal. Personally, I really enjoy spending time on our federal lands. I think a lot of them are absolutely worth protecting and keeping federal. The question is whether the current system we have is the best way to manage them, and whether we really want to allow just one person to make these decisions that impact so many of us.
Let's hear from Lynn. Lynn is in June Lake, California for our guests. Lynn, you're on. Go ahead.
Hi, yes, I live in the Inyo National Forest, and the land management is just so poor. The Forest Service says they don't have any money. People do not stay in their jobs for very long. They rotate people in and out of the office really quickly, so nothing gets done. And our forests are just deteriorating. And so it just seems like if you try to do anything on federal lands, then there's lawsuits and people are always suing each other. The Inyo National Forest was writing a new forest plan that began in 2012. It was supposed to be completed in 2016. It's now 2019. It still isn't done. And just the amount of wasted money is just so hard to watch as we watch nothing get done.
Ms. Hansen.
Thanks for that comment. I think you bring up a really great point. Like I mentioned, I get to spend a lot of time on our federal lands, and I'm really thankful for that, whether camping or hiking. And I've also noticed these problems in our forests of, we have a lot of buildup of flammable materials, which creates concerns about things like wildfires. I think a big problem, and something I've found through my research, is that it tends to be more politically popular to designate new lands and to acquire new federal lands rather than to spend resources taking care of the lands we already have. And as a result, we have a huge maintenance backlog on our federal lands. And I think a lot could be improved by really focusing more on maintaining the lands we do have, making sure we preserve those for future generations rather than continuing to acquire more.
From Wyoming, Mike joins us from Gray Bull there. Hello, Mike. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm just curious, of all this federal land that everybody talks about, and the biggest problem I can see in a lot of western states is that there is a lot of it. And
so the question to our guest is?
I want to know how come they're landlocked, and the people that landlock them, won't let you into public land that our tax dollars pay for, but yet they can use it.
Ms. Hansen.
That's a great question. And you're definitely right that federal land makes up a huge proportion of our total land in the West. In Utah, over half of our land is owned by the federal government. And it makes me think of the story of San Juan County Commissioner who has expressed some concerns with these large designations in southern Utah. And he talks about his county, only 8% of his county is made up of private lands. That means that when these monument designations are made and unilateral decisions are being made about how to manage those lands, it really restricts that area's ability to develop their local economy and even to just have certainty about what the future will hold for them.
As far as legislative efforts, have there been any to make changes to the Antiquities Act, or at least things that you think might be an improvement to the act?
There have been efforts. Recently there have been some efforts to exempt Utah from the Antiquities Act, just like Wyoming and Alaska are exempt, and those haven't made a ton of headway yet. I think more promising than state-specific exemptions would be broader and clearer limits on the president's decision-making authority. So that might look like requiring congressional approval for monuments over a certain size threshold. It might look like requiring consultation with local stakeholders like we've already talked about.
Here is Tom from Lancaster, California. Hi.
Good morning. I'd like to talk about something that happened under the last administration on our federal lands. Under the grounds of wild horses, they looked for uranium all over the place on our federal lands. They sold it to the Russians. As a tribal member on some of these lands, it was a scheme against the American public to look for uranium and sell it to Russia. And this happens like the national park systems have been set up. The tribal members that had tribal treaties, you've stolen the land, like with Bears Ear. It is incredible what happened, and it's a genocide against the native people. But the reservations should be marked like the national parks are marked, so that people know how big they are.
That's Tom from California. Megan Hansen, go ahead.
Thanks, Tom. I think you bring up a lot of points there. The issue of wild horses. We've talked about wildfire. There are a lot of these issues on federal lands that make them really complicated. And I think that should suggest even more strongly that these are big issues and we need more than one person making these big, wide, sweeping decisions about how they'll be managed. You also talked about the impacts on Native American tribes, and that's definitely been an issue with Bears Ears. I think it just goes to show that parties on both sides of the aisle, whether you're for monuments or against them, you would benefit either way from having this certainty and clear knowledge about the checks and the limits on the president's ability to designate and to alter and maybe even get rid of these monuments in the future.
When it comes then to the efforts to stop the president, if he has this power, where does the role of civil lawsuits come in? Are they effective?
You know, that's a great question. I'm not sure about that. I do know that from all the litigation I've reviewed we haven't seen a lot of progress or really any clarity come out of those. So I'm more optimistic about legislative changes that would enact clear checks and balances on the president's power.
From New Jersey in Ridgefield Park, this is Peter.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I'd like to know the mission of your organization. It just seems very suspicious. It's called the Center for Growth and Opportunity. And, you know, our country has become so overdeveloped and so polluted, and you're so concerned about management of public lands. And I'd just like to know the mission of your organization. I feel like you're maybe have some ulterior motives and represent some corporations that want to do more development, and that's what I have. That's what it is.
Oh, caller's gone. Go ahead, Megan Hansen.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that statement and that question. So as I mentioned before, our mission at the Center for Growth and Opportunity is to conduct research on policy relevant areas. And we're really, as researchers, we're free to find the questions that we think are most worth pursuing. And we do that by thinking about what policy areas most impact people's lives. And that's why we've identified public lands in the Antiquities Act as one of those areas. We're also doing research on a variety of areas, including immigration policy, occupational licensing, and looking at how regulation and the regulatory environment impacts innovation and new technologies. So this is really just one among the many issue areas that we focus on.
To his claim that the lands are already, or at least for the by and large, overdeveloped, is that something you agree with?
I don't think that's really an accurate portrayal. It depends on the lands that you're talking about. The federal estate is so large and so varied, and there's so many different landscapes with different, and they're all being used for different purposes across the U.S. Some are being used for energy development, others are preserved just for recreation, and some are preserved as wilderness, just for conservation of endangered species and wildlife. And I think that's a good thing. These lands are varied, and we should use them for the various uses that are most valuable to the American people. And we should definitely preserve them for future generations.
This is Sonia, who is from Tampa, Florida.
Hi, good morning. My question is, we just had a situation where a burial ground, a large African-American burial ground, they're not sure if the graves had been relocated prior to a housing project being put on top of the gravesite. Does the Antiquities Act affect burial grounds, and how will you protect future landmarks, grave sites, from being developed on top of without proper making sure that the grave sites have been the graves have been relocated? And I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I think that's a great concern that you bring up, and once again, it shows how complex this issue is. I'm definitely not an expert on how these burial grounds are treated under the Act, but I do think that your point brings up, once again, the idea that we should have consultation with local stakeholders. In this case, consultation should happen with those who really know the area and who are familiar with these burial grounds and know the best way to protect them and to be respectful of them.
Megan Hansen, I can't show you the full op-ed, but there's an op-ed by a gentleman named Jonathan Thompson in the High Country News, who, I'll just read you the headline: "It's time to move the Bureau of Land Management out of Washington, D.C." Is there a sense that maybe, or at least when it comes to land management issues, it's too D.C.-centric and there's not enough outreach to these areas that are directly affected?
Absolutely. I think it's a huge problem that most of the people who are making these decisions are often located thousands of miles away. They may have never visited the area that they are making decisions about. I think getting land managers closer to the land that they're managing is a great idea.
Doug in Arizona, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, Megan. I'm a gold prospector I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I prospect in the Santa Rita Mountains. And for years, we've been able to get to our gold claims. They're federal mining claims. And all of a sudden now we can't get to about 60% of them because federal lands say that they've cordoned it off. They put like three-string wire fencing all the way around it, thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of it, probably hundreds of miles. And they the ranchers lease the land for their cattle, but they've been doing it for years, and everybody's been just get along fine. And about 5 years ago, one day I went up there and I couldn't get in. And the ranchers were given these keys to get through these monstrous padlocks and huge chains, but nobody else can have them to get in. So I've got federal mining claims that I have to pay money for every year, and I haven't been on them in years. What do I do?
I wish I could tell you what to do, but I think thank you for sharing that story. I think once again it shows us how complex these land management regimes are and how much they affect local people. I think your story also illustrates this problem with uncertainty. When these land management decisions are being made really centrally, it leaves local people who use that land and may have been using it for a long time, it leaves them in the dark about how they're going to be impacted and how their lives might change all of a sudden because a land manager decided to put up a fence or change access. Access to public lands is another key issue.
This is from Illinois. Bob, good morning.
For a long time. Yes, good morning. I actually grew up in Alaska, even though I'm in Illinois now. I'm 73 years old, and I'm concerned about something that I have considered an antiquity, and it's not precisely what you're addressing, but it certainly hinges on it. I grew up with Mount McKinley, and then one morning, a couple of years back, I woke up to Denali. And during the 1972 Native Land Claims Act development, there were comments about keeping things named the way they were originally named when statehood took place. What happened? Can you explain that?
That's a great question. I am definitely not an expert on how those naming conventions happen. But once again, I think your story speaks to this idea of central management of federal lands, central land managers coming in and changing the way things are managed, often without the input of local people.
From Kathy in Colorado, in Gunnison, good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling to ask about the speaker and her Growth for Opportunity organization. I understand that it's a Koch-funded nonprofit research group in the Huntsman School of Business, and that they, received $25 million pledge from the Charles Koch Foundation just recently.
Thanks for that comment. We do, in fact, receive money from the Charles Koch Foundation among a variety of donors and individuals that support our mission, and we are extremely thankful for their support. They allow us to do the research that we do. Our research is completely independent from our funding, which means that I, as a researcher, get to focus on the questions that I think are most meaningful and that I think have the most potential to help improve public policy, and I'm sure thankful for all the donations that we get.
You're part of the Huntsman School of Business. Governor Huntsman, what's his influence, I suppose, the research that you do on the topic of land management?
Yeah, he does not have any real formal interaction with the center. The Huntsman Business School is, of course, named after him, and he has a lot of interaction there. But we at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, we're a completely independent organization, and we are lucky to be affiliated with Utah State. We're on campus there.
Aside from then, if you don't see a legislative change, what other significant changes could you see, or at least what other avenues could be explored if legislatively nothing's going to happen?
That's a great question. I think that having local people get involved and voice their concerns is a good way to help drive change. Even if we don't see legislative changes now, I think it's important for local people to speak up and talk about how they're impacted by these changes in land management.
This is, again, our guest is Megan Hansen with the Center for Growth and Opportunity, growthopportunity.org, talking about the topic of federal land management. When did this become a concern then, as far as your study is concerned? When did you start paying most attention to this?
I think this has really been a concern throughout the history of the Antiquities Act. When the law was passed, there were a lot of discussions among members of Congress who were concerned that the law might be used to designate really large areas. And those who were sponsoring the bill said, no, it's going to be used for the smallest area compatible. But then throughout history, we've seen many monuments designated. In fact, almost 24 monuments have been designated that are over 1 million acres in size. So I think it's been a concern throughout history, and perhaps is becoming more controversial and more visible right now thanks to social media and the internet and the ability of people to really voice their concerns.
Before we let you go, a viewer from Utah calls us. This is Mark. Hello.
Hello, my name is Mark. I'm from Monticello. The question is, I've retired out in Monticello, Utah about 3-4 years ago. Seen an incredible increase in tourism and traffic coming into these areas, but I've not seen the land management. There's great people, just not enough of them. So if they were going to do 1.3 million acres, how are they going to staff that up so there was going to be adequate coverage? And are they thinking about creative partnerships between the federal government and private entities to help out in land management? Thank you.
Great question, Mark. Thank you so much. I think you bring up a really great point, which is that, as we've talked about, it's more popular to designate these lands than to take care of them. We have a huge maintenance backlog on federal lands, and just establishing a national monument isn't going to do enough to actually preserve these areas, especially if more and more tourists are coming to these areas and there may not be facilities or rules or staff in place to make sure they're adequately protected. I think you also bring up a great solution. A great idea for solutions is public-private partnerships. The Forest Service has used these for decades to manage many of its recreation areas across the U.S., and I think that could be a great option as well for national monuments.
The website for the organization, growthopportunity.org. Megan Hansen serves as the research director for the Center for Growth and Opportunity, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
That's it for the program today. Don't forget, tomorrow's program will come to you at 7 o'clock. You can watch also the Salute to America starting at 6 o'clock on our C-SPAN network. With that in mind, we thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.